Hey, let me just tell your audience, I did not just come from the dentist. I was stricken about 3 days ago with the thing called Bell's palsy. So if my face is lopsided, it's not your computer off angle. It's my face is frozen. So I'm doing the best I can. The show must go on, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Hello and welcome to the Booster Pack. My name is Rands, and this is the show where we unwrap the stories and crack the mysteries of collectible games each and every episode. And today, we are going to throw back and hear some stories that were born in the offices and the hallways of one of the biggest trading card companies of the 20th century, Fleer. Now, we're not going to be talking about their scores of sports cards that they released throughout the heights of those crazes, whether it be basketball, baseball. They printed billions of those. No, we're going to be talking about their foray into the realm of collectible games during the mid-1990s. Yes, they were no doubt inspired by Magic the Gathering from Wizards of the Coast and the entire collectible game craze, which they went from trading card game company at that time into also game publishing and sort of chased the collectible card game boom, as many people have called it. Joining us today is somebody who will help us venture back and piece together the episodic story of that time of Fleer. Yes, they are somebody who helped them explore the then final frontier of card gaming and became Fleer's first officer in the tabletop gaming world. Or, as it's probably better put on their business card, Fleer's manager of game development back then. Yes, over their time at Fleer Skybox, they were a collectible card game jack of all trades. They were helping oversee organized play, putting products into production, liaising with license holders, and when they even got spare time, doing design on games themselves. Join me in welcoming to the Booster Pack somebody who managed the Overpower collectible card game and the Star Trek, the original series card game in 1996, for Fleer. That is Stephen Domzalski. Stephen, thank you for joining me on the show today.
It's great to be here, Rance. Thank you. And you did a great job describing all the stuff that I did. You've done your research.
Excellent. I like to come prepared, and I like to pick apart this stuff. I'm so excited because there's some games here that I think are some of my favorites. You know, this is not my first time talking about Overpower on this show, and I think it's going to be excellent to get your side of this story. You know, we spoke to the very initial designers early on, but I can't wait to see sort of, you in this more, to excuse the phrasing, but more maternal role for that particular game, sort of shepherding it and helping it grow up in the world as it is. So again, thank you so much. Now, before we jump into that sort of side of things and Fleer, let's just do a little retrospective on you yourself. Tell me how you got into, just geek interests and sort of the gaming world and everything like that.
Sure. So I was, my kids at the time, I started to show interest. We collected trading cards, specifically the G.I. Joe trading cards. And I was working for a government service publications department, RCA, and I saw an ad in the paper for an editorial director for Fleer doing trading cards. And so I wrote this really great cover letter that had all kinds of vernacular that would kind of get their attention, and this, getting this job would be the ultimate chase card and things like that. And I got the job. So I was Fleer's editorial director, and my job was to develop trading card sets, come up with the themes, not just Spider-Man Ultra, Marvel Masterpieces, X-Men.
So you were all of a sudden, getting the best staff discount ever for your kids, helping them collect trading cards all of a sudden.
So after a couple of sets, and Fleer was just not about. They had the Marvel license being owned by Marvel, and but they also did a lot of licensing. So we would do trading cards on whatever was the hot cartoon license at the time, and I was the only one in the entire corporate building that played Magic the Gathering. So right before Comic-Con that year, I was pulled aside and said, "Hey, we've got you some interviews. We understand you play Magic the Gathering. Tell me about your experience." And I did. So when you go to Comic-Con, here's interviews you have. You can do them in the lobby or do it in your hotel room. But these are people that have game designs because we want to get into the CCG arena.
Wow. Okay.
So at Comic-Con that year, I saw 3 different game designs, and 2 of them were very similar to Magic. They were based on like a, tapping mana type of a construct, and the third one, if I can recall, was very much in tune with like the Infinity Stones, and so I took all that back and I took notes, but then we saw the Stern Brothers game, and that just blew us all away. I didn't even want to present the other games because their game was just so true to what we were trying to go for.
Awesome. Well, you mentioned the Sterns in there, and anybody interested who may not have seen it, we can go back and they can have a look on this channel or on this feed and find the episode I did with them. And they sort of talk about their side of this story. But that's so interesting because, you said you heard about these sort of other games that were similar to Magic, you played Magic, and I was just sort of interested in sort of what did you sort of see, like what was it about that game, and sort of what form was that game in when you sort of first saw it, and what were some of the things that sort of really captured your attention? Because one of the interesting things you mentioned there was Infinity Stones, and obviously having the Marvel license, that's very limiting if you're going to expand, as Overpower does. So tell me about that. Tell me about your experience, sort of how you found the Sterns and how that game impressed you.
So I didn't find this. Bill Gemmis, who was the president of the division at the time, had been soliciting. I guess they had an ad, or were looking for game designers to bring a mechanic to Fleer, and I guess that's how the Stern Brothers got connected with as the other developers that I interviewed. The Stern Brothers game had more of the feel of managing a team of heroes on the streets of Manhattan, jumping on building sides and grabbing lampposts and then bashing them over heads, and just a rough and tumble battle of superheroes versus superheroes, or villains versus villains, and it just captured that feel. And so we started developing that game, but Bill Gemmis, he was very brass tacks. He wanted something that was simple. He didn't want something that was over complex. And he wanted a game that didn't last forever. You didn't want any monopolies or risks. You wanted something that you could play, and in a relatively short amount of time, there would be a victor, and then you could start the next game.
Yeah, well, and also it helps tournaments and stuff down the line. And I've also heard many card game designers sort of say, the great thing about card game or collectible card games is that you're editing your deck. So the quicker you can play, the quicker you can go back and make those adjustments and changes.
Correct. So, I mean, Bill was a really brilliant guy. He was like a member of Mensa, and so he came in one day and he had totally like jettisoned a lot of the elements that we were working with. And he said, come in, and he had mocked up a bunch of cards, and we played this poker type game that involved betting and bluffing and folding, and it still had the hero element, and you had a team of heroes, and he was still able to bring in a lot of the things the Sterns envisioned, like lampposts and elements and maneuvers and stuff, but it had this poker feel, which we were all very excited about, and it played pretty quick rate, and it was you could do different things. One hand you could load up all your heroes with specials and power cards, and then fold and lose the bet, and then come back a hell in the next battle and win. And there wasn't any game on the market that was like that. It was so unique in the way that it played.
That's amazing. So that's so interesting that you mentioned, you saw all these sort of Magic clones. And I think one of the things that has made Overpower, it's still played by many people today, it's still got an active fan community, endure so much, is that it was so different to a lot of those other games in that era. It felt like there was that risk of sort of almost like more of a traditional card game, like a poker, or like a blackjack, or sort of like a sort of an odds playing game that you don't usually get with a collectible card game, where it's more like role playing inspired, or sort of other sort of elements of gaming sort of come in as well. So tell me, like, what was do you remember, like, tell me a little bit more about that sort of development and you sort of honing what the Stern brothers and what Gemis has brought to you and sort of melding them into a singular thing. Tell me a little bit more of what you did in that time.
Well, so it was myself and Ron Peraza, and we were kind of the core of that gaming team. And so, in addition to Ron was the art director, so he was responsible for a lot of commissioning all the art that went on to all the cards, and I kind of handled some of the working with Marvel. It's interesting, and I'm going to jump a little bit ahead to DC. So when we just had Marvel, the company up in Park Avenue, New York, they really didn't have like this possessive, like, hey, there are characters and we're going to dictate who gets what. They were really kind of hands off. They just wanted to make sure. I mean, they looked at everything that we had did, but they really didn't make a lot of recommendations or demands. Wolverine had to have a fighting of 8, or they didn't really do any of that. They really let us do that. On the contrary, when Skybox became part of the Fleer company, that gave us rights to the DC license. Wow. And so DC was a lot more staunch in their demands, and the number one thing out there was they wanted the characters to have intellect. Up until then, it was just fighting, energy, and strength, which Professor X, we kind of encapsulated his power, energy, and captured things like that. Where they had Lex Luthor and a lot of Batman, and so they wanted intellect to be an important part, just as much as fighting and strength and things like that.
So that's so fascinating. Let me jump in here because I'm really interested by that point that you're making there. So when you were first developing the game, Fleer was it was owned by the Marvel company, and at that point, when you guys were sort of first looking for rule sets and stuff like that, when you were rejecting things like these magic sets, and as you mentioned before, like an Infinity Stone game, did you have in mind that this game could grow out to other franchises, or was initially it always just going to be just Marvel all the time?
No, when you talk about the mechanic that Overpower was, you can't not help think about other licenses being a part of it. Because once in a while the comics at the time would do crossover issues where they would fight amongst different licenses. They would do that. The artists would do that once in a while, and so that was out there. So it wasn't that much of a leap to think about this game. And wouldn't it be cool for Namor to be fighting Aquaman? So yeah, the thought went there, of course, but you don't think that far ahead. You're in a trench developing a card game, and we had this game, and I think the Stern Brothers game had the 3 elements to start, and so we kind of went with that, and that was part of the development of the combat feature in Overpower. Never thinking that, well, hey, there's got to be intellect. And it's kind of like you're done at that point. You're playing the game. You've already loved it. And then you get this licensing opportunity with DC. And they're like, no, you got to have intellect. So we thought it through. And it's like, well, why not add another icon? It's not really going to change the game that much. You can still play it with the old cards. So anybody who had already invested was still good to go. And then, of course, that gave us the opportunity later on to produce IQ, Overpower IQ, and give intellect and go and restructure all the stats on all the existing heroes and bring in some other heroes and stuff like that.
So I do want to talk about that, sort of going back and sort of, reworking the Marvel side to incorporate this, DC mandate, as you've said, for this intellect addition, which I think it was a good addition to the game. Absolutely. It added that little bit more of design space and stuff like that. But before we get there, the game did live in 2 or 3 sets before DC came along. So let's talk about like sort of just a little bit more about the sort of development side. Do you have any other stories about that sort of like those sort of early days where you know, because you were basically, you know, you and Ron were shepherding the project after it left the Stern brothers' hands and got to market. Like, do you remember anything else interesting that might have changed along that way, or any other really interesting, fascinating things that could have happened, you know, between, you know, them handing it off and you guys, you know, pushing it out and releasing the game?
At that point, it was really, we had a pretty good mechanic. Because it's not it's not a very card. I mean, you've got your basic power cards, each one from each icon. You've got hero with its stats, and then each hero got special abilities that were germane to that particular hero. So a lot of it was just developing those things and thinking of the editorial element, more so than the gaming element. You know, what would Cyclops' different powers be, and what should they be called, and what kind of artwork should we get to depict that? There's a lot of that went into the gaming, not just the mechanic. And that was Ron and I doing all of that.
It's so impressive because obviously, you know, Fleer coming from that sort of trading card background rather than the trading card game background or that gaming background really let the cards explode. You know, the art was the first, I think, in the industry that sort of went all the way to the end as far as like a proper game goes. And it finished like there was so many touches on the game that made it look so unique, so independent, that attracted not only gamers, but also collectors as well.
That was just a natural tendency of the way we design trading cards. You know, first and foremost, we were a trading card company that was all about art. I mean, that's what Fleer was doing for the licensing side of it. Marvel and some of the others, it's all about the artwork. So of course we didn't want to constrain them with some sort of a design element that kind of framed it in. We wanted to go to the edge and let, you know, explosions really be explosions and laser beams go off the edge of the card and all. And it just gave it all that feel.
It's so interesting. You know, I love that was sort of the innovation that sort of Fleer's expertise brought to the game. And it's something that honestly, only in the last couple of years, I think that more contemporary or collectible card games are only catching up with, you know, via special rarities and special sets. And I think it was something that, you know, if you look back at those cards, they were, you know, works of art. They definitely stood out amongst all the other collectible card games in that era. Now, I do want to ask, you know, as I mentioned, you know, there was gamers and collectors alike clamoring for these because they look so gorgeous. What do you remember about the initial launch of Overpower, bringing it out, whether it came out in 1995, which is crazy time for collectible card games because there was literally 40 games plus come out that exact year at Gen Con. Tell me all about your stories about actually the very first launch of Overpower and the reception that you got for it.
Yeah, I'll never forget. I mean, I had cartons and cartons and cartons in my hotel room of these entry-level pre-cellophaned starter decks, pre-playable starter decks, 3 different themes. And, you know, I had to carry those down to the tournament areas. We worked the deal. So we were really proud of ourselves. We beat Wizards of the Coast. We had the first noted big money tournament. So the plan was we worked the deal because we couldn't really do the game training at the Fleer booth or the Marvel booth because that was all about trading cards and comic books and the celebrities and everything. And so the traffic we were going to get from having people have to sit down at tables and learn the game and play it and all, that wouldn't work. So we worked a deal with a comic company that had a really huge space comic book seller called Mile High Comics out of Denver. And so he gave us a good amount of space in his booth. And, you know, of course, it brought him a lot of people. He got to sell more comics. And so for an entry fee, people got a starter deck. They learned how to play. And then we would have a quick little tournament at the end of the day. And then the winners from each day, Comic-Con was 4 days. We had this $5,000 prize at the end of that last Sunday. So it was very exciting. I mean, it was overwhelming because we didn't really have, you know, we really couldn't have anticipated the audience we were going to get. It was just myself and Ron and Theo Stern came. We brought him, and I think we had like one other person helping us. and we were far away from the Flair booth, so we had walkie-talkies to communicate, and just nonstop every hour training. You know, I don't know how many people we trained over that course of that event, but it was very exciting and it got a lot of attention. And I know that the person who won was kind of young in age, so that was kind of exciting that somebody so youthful was able to win this big check. They got a big cardboard check for $5,000 presented to him by Wolverine. It was really, really cool.
No, I do want to just mention there, you did say innovation, and I'm so impressed to hear about, you guys doing those that first sort of big money tournament. I can't think of another example prior to, Magic the Gathering's Pro Tour the following year where that sort of became part of the collectible game culture, and sort of started to legitimize the sort of medium in this competitive way. But what I'm really interested there is, because you mentioned them in there, is starter decks. The other thing about Overpower is it had fixed starter decks, where the thing to do at the time was randomize them, which would come later. Tell me about, do you have any memories about how that sort of came about in the starter deck space? You guys were crafting these decks so that people would be able to play most efficiently out of the box, because other games like Magic, like Jihad, came with a random mix of cards where you open it up and you can kind of play, but not efficiently. Do you remember anything about that production?
So it was all about, you have to remember the license and the audience that license was tailored to, right? So if you think about Magic the Gathering, that was not targeted at 11-year-old kids, right? That was a certain element, and Next Gen had its own age demographic. Marvel Comics is kids who read comic books, kids that were watching Saturday morning cartoons. And so, kids have developed a lot in the time because of the internet and everything. But at that time, we wanted a game that was no barriers to entry. You buy a deck and you could play right away. Two kids could go into a hobby store. They could each buy a starter deck and they play each other and have a really great game. And each game that they played could be different with different outcomes with just one starter deck. And then if you wanted to buy booster packs to try to get other characters to add them to your team, that was the part where building the decks and stuff came later. But the goal was getting people to play like right out of the box, get the game and make it easy so that, a 7-year-old or an 11-year-old could play this game.
Now, let's talk about mechanically. Like, I'm really impressed that, you guys had that vision of like, hey, the easiest way to get people into this game is to give them a actual sealed, proper experience, not this randomized experience that other card games were doing. But tell me, as the game started to grow, you mentioned how it was a relatively simple game. There was more things that got layered in with each set, things like event cards and battle sites and stuff like that. Tell me about how you were involved with how Overpower started to grow and what the philosophy behind that growth was mechanically as the game went from set to set to set to set.
So the initial rollout came with a certain number of characters. So the goal is eventually you want to come out with future sets so that the company makes more money from their concept. You want to introduce more characters. And then you also want to add other elements to spice up the game. People who have been jumped on board at the very beginning, maybe they're getting a little bit bored. Maybe things are getting stagnant. And even the introduction of a couple, bunch of new heroes with their own specials, that might be not enough to shake it up. So you introduce other elements. So it's like, well, there's so many different things in the Marvel universe that we could introduce. So we introduced the location cards, and they had an element. So if you had if your characters were playing at a certain location, they got benefits from that. And so now you bring in that flavor. Everybody now you've got the Fantastic Four Plaza, and you've got the different places, and you get elements from that. And so it adds another development. And so for somebody who's trying to get into the game, somebody teaching them, you can leave that element out and teach them the basic core, and then you can bring that in layer and just add the different layers. So we brought in that, and then later on was the mission cards, and another feel for the game. And they were all they all had to do with another release. So we come out with another release. Let's bring another element. There's plenty of things in the universe, artifacts that we could introduce and help market that set, but add another realm to the card game to keep it stimulating for the players who jumped on at the very beginning.
I mean, I think that that's genius. And obviously, you know, a lot of collectible card games have followed that model. And it was something that was sort of brewing in games like Magic and stuff at the time, where there was new elements being released. But you guys sort of solidified it, where it's like, this new set has got this new mechanic. And, you know, we're bringing out events now that sort of tie in to those mission cards and everything like that. Was that design, was that done by you and Ron? Like the Theo and Michael interview that I had earlier, they said they basically took their hands off once they gave the game to you. Were you responsible for exploring that space, or was there other team members at Fleer that did that?
No, it was basically Ron and I.
Wow, awesome.
The Stern brothers, I always kind of looked and said, like, the game that they gave us, no way really looks like the game that eventually came out. And it was corporate policy that you know, they weren't involved. I guess because they felt that they would have had to pay them something, and they didn't feel the need to do that.
Well, I'm so interested in that as well. I'm also interested, you know, we mentioned before about this sort of interesting innovation of sort of, you know, big money tournament play. Pardon me. Like we mentioned before that we were sort of talking about this big money sort of tournament play and this sort of interesting sort of organized play system. And you know, after Overpower comes out and sort of innovates in this sort of space, Magic the Gathering starts to do sort of pro tours and stuff like that. And what's really interesting, and something that I love about Overpower, is it sort of started to explore these same options. It did sort of regional events, it did national events. Tell me about, like, you were the person, I believe, in charge of sort of this Overpower Legion, which is basically like the player organization for Overpower while I was at Fleer. Do you have any stories from how that came about and those organized play days that you want to share with us?
Well, we knew that the grassroots element that was going to sell cards and keep the game thriving was to get the hobby shops and the comic book stores the ability to have what Magic was doing with their tournaments. We needed to have an element to do that as well. And so the Overpower Legion was a combination of, you know, a newsletter that had, you know, fun facts, and we would do specials to entice join, and we would help work with the comic book stores for a tournament with pricing and structure and rankings. And then we brought somebody on. We actually had a person who was working. She was the editorial person for the DC line, and we brought her over. Her name was Kathy Pro, and she took over and managed solely the Overpower Legion once it was developed.
So that's so cool. Now, you guys were obviously introducing new elements with the game each release, you know, and obviously when you're organizing something like a tournament, you need everybody to be on the same level. Do you have any like stories that you might remember of like any sort of challenges that, you know, holding tournaments for a game where new elements were sort of coming out as far as like, you know, new rules and new settings? And obviously Overpower also has, you know, deck building restrictions that other games didn't have. Do you have any other sort of stories about, you know, people rubbing up against that? Or, you know, did you find any frustration from players or anything like that at that time who were showing up and confused by, you know, what had sort of been laid down by the sort of the Overpower Legion and the sort of the organized play program?
So I think the beauty in Overpower in the earlier days, because the game was pretty, I mean, the rules were pretty tight. And so the early days of tournaments, we really didn't have too many rules conflicts or disputes, or the tournaments ran fairly smoothly. It wasn't until we started to develop some of the crazy cards and some cards that may have been broken, and that created some rules problems and how you play certain specials. You know, we coded all the cards, so it was easy to categorize what the game mechanic was. And so that helped the players later on identify cards and any cards that were causing problems, so that we could make definitive rules on how that's played and what the chain reaction was if you played a card, as far as causality. Could I play, if I play this, can I still play this? Those types of things. And I think that happens with every every card game that's being exercised. You're going to come in that. But we were lucky. We didn't have a lot of that in the beginning. It wasn't until as the game got more and more complex with the introduction of other things and more specials. And of course, you know, anytime you're working with the company that does licensing, there are people that are cutting side bets with Hillshire Farms and all the different promotions that we did. You know, people want exclusivities. I want an exclusive card. I'm going to give you X thousands of dollars of advertising if you give me an exclusive card that we could put as an insert. And so that gets a little out of hand. And then, of course, we were all guilty of, you know, these tournaments. And so we would alter people's cards. You know, they were like not for tournament play. So that was always an element that people would argue. It's like, well, this is right. Well, no, it's not. It's not for tournament play. But those types of things that were part of the history of the tournament part of it.
Yeah, I always find those sort of sides of things so fascinating, so interesting that you know, because, you know, you're doing deals and stuff like that with promotions, that there's certain cards that people can't get and all that sort of stuff. You know, like one of the most famous cards in Overpower is Web-Headed Wizard is obviously one that was quite infamous in those early days as a hard card to get. People might be able to see that on the screen now, but we'll dig into that a little bit later. What I did really want to talk about, though, is, you know, you sort of mentioned it there with licensing and all that sort of stuff, and you mentioned it earlier as well, that intellect side of thing. As the game starts to grow, you incorporate DC, which as a fan, comic book fan, is an absolute dream, because, you know, for the first time, there's a game that's, you know, you're playing Superman against, you know, Spider-Man, or, you know, Batman against Dr. Xavier or whatever. You can really start to meld the comic book worlds that these people love at their comic book store and sort of bring them together. So tell me about what it was like working with DC, and tell me about what it was about, you know, the intellect mechanic that had to come in, and even what the response was to having to relaunch sort of the Marvel line in a soft way with IQ to sort of add that into the gameplay as well. What did the fans think? What is, you know, what did DC be like dictating to do? Tell me all about that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, the culture differences in the approach to the card game between DC and Marvel were night and day. Marvel was very laid back, as long as, you know, you weren't making Wolverine a 2 fighting, they couldn't care less whether it was a 7 or an 8. They trusted us that we were balancing the game and we were assigning stats on the grand scheme of the whole game. DC were rigid. They were like, no, Batman has to have these stats, and Lex Luthor has to have these stats, and they really prescribed for almost every character what, and it kind of, we would argue back, we would push back, and we would try to justify changes or those mandates that they wanted, so that it worked within the game. And sometimes we won and we're capable, and sometimes not so much. I don't have any specific examples, but it was just an interesting. It didn't really halt production or anything. It was just different. Having had worked with Marvel, it was just so easygoing to come in, and, you know, I think Ron and I sat for a couple of weeks and did all the initial stats for the characters that were going to be in the initial DC rollout, and presented them to the editorial group at DC, and they came back with all these edits. And wow, so they paid really. Now, I don't know if any of them even knew how the game played. They were looking at their perception of what their characters needed to have as far as this grid of capabilities was, and so they did that kind of like with blinders on, because it's like, these are our heroes and this is what we feel the stats are, with no real tie to how is that going to play in the game. So we had to work with that, and it was okay.
It's so interesting. I recently had another person on in an earlier episode, and they spoke about the same challenges that DC presented over sort of Marvel in the same sort of space. I'm so fascinated that there's, you know, this history of this sort of dichotomy between those two licenses threads back all the way back to Overpower, and I'm sure beyond. Now, I did want to ask, do you, like, you just sort of reminded me of this question. I didn't really have it planned, but do you remember anything that you brought to a licensor, whether it be Marvel or DC, and they basically not just stats, but any like mechanic or idea, and they just said outright, you can't do that. We're not interested, or that doesn't fit our brand.
Collectible card games, it was a subculture that not everybody was aware of, and you had to explain it to them, and then once you explained it, I think their eyes would glaze over, and they were kind of like, okay, whatever. So like even when, and we're going to get to the Star Trek one, Paramount they were pretty laid back as well. They were more like the way Marvel was. They trusted the game design, and that game mechanic was even more simple than Overpower was, and they were more focused on the way you depicted the artwork and the images that we took from the screen, and you couldn't show certain scenes that we wanted to show. But they were pretty much hands off as well, which was really a pleasure.
That's awesome. So we'll jump into that in just a second. But what
you had asked one other question about, so when we had to do Marvel IQ, because obviously now we're out there and people are trying to play this game, and they've got DC characters with 4 stats, and they've got Marvel characters with 3 stats, and we had to work out how that mechanic was going to, with a back into how that mechanic would work. It was a pleasure to go back and revisit all the Marvel characters and give them 4 stats. People looked at that. There was 2 schools. I mean, there was some that felt as if we were ripping them off. It was just an excuse for us to sell more cards. And I already invested in all these cards, and now they're worthless because I got to buy. Well, no, they're not. You can still play with them. You don't have to invest in these. But look at all the vistas that it opens as far as the way you can play the game. And of course, we were introducing some other characters. We always brought something new with every set that we released. But a lot of people were excited. Of course, now Marvel was on the same par with DC as far as having 4 stats, and it was now a fresh approach to the game. And so those people who were sticking with it from the beginning, they were appreciative of the opportunity to have something new.
Well, this is a question that's going to come up, or was going to come up later in the community questions, and I did want to just shout out Ross Dobler for this sort of inspiration for this question. But one of the questions he asks was, later on, you guys released battle sites where old character cards can sort of sit under them, and then you can sort of interact with them during the game through specials and stuff like that. Was that a way to mitigate the fact that maybe some of those old cards were now obsolete and could still find a use?
Yes. I mean, the goal was, as a marketer of the product, you never wanted anybody to have your product that they paid good money for and they have felt cheated, or that there was a waste of some sort. So the opportunity to reinvigorate anything and give it new life, it did 2 things. The person who had the cards were appreciative, and people who didn't, somebody who never bought that set, who came in a little later, now you create kind of like a demand and desire for them to go and buy older sets to try to get those and bring them into the game. So yeah, it serves a good purpose ultimately.
Obviously, at this point, there's a lot going on at Fleer, and obviously, Image comes along later when it goes to Marvel, and the game sort of gets moved to an entirely different company away from Fleer. But tell me about sort of what your memories are in those sort of last year that Overpower existed at Fleer. What was it like with the sort of gaming division sort of getting let go? Was there any other Overpower sets in development at that time? I know that certain people have heard about a third DC set that never saw the light of day. Tell me about your memories from that particular era for Overpower.
Yeah, there was a lot of great ideas at the time. I mean, the game was holding its own. I'm not sure how it ranked at the time, but we were always proud of how well it did versus these mega, like Wizards of the Coast's Magic and the Decipher game. And we were up there. We consistently had a good audience, and we did well at presence at shows and our tournaments. So there was a lot of things in development. We had grown staff with some other people. It was one of those things. It all had to do with the corporation at the time, Marvel went bankrupt.
I was going to say, like, coming on from, there was during the 90s, and I actually talked about this with a previous guest, John Jackson Miller. There was a big sort of comic book bust in the sort of mid 90s. While collectible card games were sort of on the rise, comic books were on the way down. So that sort of speaks to what you mentioned there.
Yeah. So, when you're developing card games, any of these independent companies that are working on a card game, if they have a license, whoever holds that license, they have to pay a fee. That it's an upfront fee, and then there's probably a percentage of sales that goes towards owning that license for that particular application. When we were owned by Marvel, that all those costs were foregone because that was our parent company. So when Marvel went bankrupt, one of the first things it did was divested it. So it sold off Panini stickers, it sold off Fleer Skybox, a couple other things. So now, I was in charge of not only the card games, but I was still, at the time, I was in charge of the trading cards as well, Marvel Masterpieces and Ultra Spider-Man. And so when you looked at your cost of goods sold, when you would develop your spreadsheet on what it would cost to produce that set, now you had like 2 line items on your spreadsheet of costs with the licensing fee and royalties that you didn't have before. And so it made the cost of goods prohibitive. So we couldn't effectively produce those cards with those licenses at cost effective rate. And so they got rid of so Ron and I were let go. They disbanded that trading arm. And then Ron got picked up by Marvel, who then they orchestrated a couple other sets. I think they did Classic Overpower and Image Overpower and X-Men. Yeah. And I followed it from, part of it at that point, I followed it. And it was a shame because I think it lost that severance and recapture. It kind of lost some momentum that was kind of critical. And it just, I don't think, and then they also ran into a lot of, Marvel, when we were part of Fleer, whose expertise was cards, when they went out on their own, they ran into some production problems and quality problems that they didn't have before. And so when you have this suddenly come up, it kind of like draws a negative focus that it never had before. And I think that was part of Marvel's loss of interest in it. And then, I was so thrilled a couple years ago to discover that the game still was alive and thriving just on old sets being sold and groups of people making their own cards and it's just so cool. And I follow a lot of they just had this tournament this past weekend up in Buffalo. It's just really cool to see all that. I mean, it's small groups that are you see around the world, but it's still alive, and it brings a tear to my eye to see that it's still. I was a part of the session of that, and it's a feeling of pride.
It's so cool to see the Overpower fandom. I love the Overpower fandom. And that tournament at Peacebridge, I followed the news coming out of that. It was fantastic to see all of that stuff going on there. And it's great to sort of see everything. And unfortunately, like you mentioned, there was production issues with the X-Men cards being slightly bigger than the other cards and everything like that sort of scarred it. And eventually, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, but in our case, unfortunately, Wizards of the Coast ended up getting the Marvel license and releasing some unrelated games. It's really interesting. I think that you guys captured, through the magic of what the Stearns had done and their vision, and then the magic of Bill coming in and sort of going, no, we need to make this simpler. And then the licenses that had with and the time that it was coming out, it was a way for people to connect with the comic book characters that they loved, whether it was on screen or whether it was on the page. And it really has endured over this time. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about Overpower. So before we go out and we sort of step away, obviously, you shared some memories there about, the less desirable days from Fleer and its time with the Overpower sort of game. Do you have any other great memories or anything we haven't talked about so far from your time working on this beloved collectible card game that is Overpower over those sort of, what is it, 3-ish years that you worked on it?
There's just so many memories. I really enjoyed when we started to get into the tournament circuit. Like one of my coolest memories, I would go and judge and run some tournaments. If they gave me the budget to go to another state, then I would fly to these comic book stores, and just to see the throngs of people there playing Overpower, it was just really, really cool. One of my favorites was there was a small con in Asbury Park, New Jersey. And so I live in New Jersey. So that was an easy one for me to handle. It didn't really take any expense or anything. Excuse me. My oldest son at the time was 11, and he was a pretty good Overpower card game player. Of course, he had wonderful access to cards. and he was pretty good at picking up the game, and he was pretty good at building decks and playing it. And so my whole family went to Asbury Park, and I went and ran the tournament, and his name is Steve as well. He entered the tournament and he ended up winning. And one of my favorite moments was the look on the I think I was like 28 years old, who he played against in the final round. The look on his face to have lost an 11-year-old was just so cool. It's just such a cool thing. And to me, it epitomized for me what Overpower was really intended to be, is this game that here's a 28-year-old invested in this game at a tournament playing it with an 11-year-old who the game was really intended for. And they're battling out, and the younger person was the victor. That was a really cool, I mean, of course, with my son, but just that whole thing epitomized what the game was supposed to be all about.
That's such a cool story. I love that story. And I think you're right. Going back to, the shared vision that, the Stern brothers and Bill Jamis had, he wanted it to be a game that appealed for kids, whereas obviously the Stern brothers wanted to be a game that appealed for fans. And seeing those two meet in a final of a tournament, regardless of the size, is absolutely beautiful, that it carries that legacy of the game with it. And I absolutely love that story. I had not heard it before, but that's absolutely tremendous. Now, what I do want to do is that's sort of going to wrap up our time with Overpower. I think it's a beautiful game, and I love what the community is doing with it now. But while you were at Fleer, that wasn't their only foray into collectible card games. So at the same time, you were in charge of Overpower, doing this amazing stuff with the community, doing this sort of, you used the word before, grassroots sort of element of building up tournaments and creating this almost family, this Overpower family that sort of came out. It was a big corporate game by a big trading card company featuring two of the biggest entertainment licenses out there, but it did feel like it was like a family community. It was a small enough community. You mentioned you didn't know where it ranked. I think for most of its life, Overpower was number 4 on the trading card game charts behind, a couple of other games, Star Wars and Legend of the Five Rings and of course, Magic the Gathering. But it's so amazing to hear about all that. But while you were doing all that, concurrently, you were also working on another license, one of the most famous sci-fi licenses of all time, and doing stuff in that collectible game space. So what I want to do is I want to rewind way back to when that sort of started, in the sort of middle of the sort of heyday of Overpower. You're sort of told that there's going to be another collectible card game in Fleer's quiver, or Fleer Skybox at that point's quiver, which was the Star Trek The Original Series card game. So obviously that's important to distinguish it from the Decipher Star Trek Next Generation card game at the time. Tell me, what's the first that you hear about this whole new project and this whole thing that you're going to have to shepherd?
So as I recall, Jemis came running into our office, Ron and I's office, and said, "We got the original series license. We got a coup over Decipher. We got the original series license. We're going to do our own game." And it was just like, wow, well, that's cool. As popular as Next Gen was, original series was everything. That just Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. Come on, the Enterprise. It's so we were very, very excited. So once again, you start soliciting for mechanics, and we saw a couple of interesting things. The people. It's interesting. The people who were the winning mechanic that we selected were actually very popular in the TSR world with Dungeons and Dragons. It was Jeff Grubb, Margaret Weiss, and Don Perrin, who Margaret did the Dragonlance series, and Jeff Grubb wrote a couple novels with TSR as well, and Don did his same. They were all involved in Dungeons and Dragons, and it's for them to come and present this game mechanic on Star Trek was kind of like, it was just kind of fascinating. It's like you wouldn't have expected that. It's like of all people to be presenting this, it's you guys. But their game was wonderful, and it was once again, it was different than so many other games because you would, in most collectible card games, the Spocks and the Kirks would be like these rare. You'd have to be searching for it. Well, what fun would that be if you can't play a game and beam down with the three and a bunch of red shirts and see what's going to happen? So this game involved the Enterprise, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and you got to play them on every game you played. They were part of your crew. And so it was the other characters that were the variables and the missions and the weapons and things. And you played this game. The mechanic was different. It was unique. We looked at a lot of different games that were out there, and you could see a lot of the traditional card games had classic mechanics involved, like the Wizards of the Coast was tapping mana, and then the what's the other popular game that had Scully and Mulder? I can't think of the license.
X-Files.
That was kind of like based on Clue, boiling it down and Discovery. So you see a lot of these classic game mechanics being introduced and fit into a collectible card game. So the base element of the original series was kind of like a rock, paper, scissors type of mechanic, where you brought in other elements and kind of beefed up what you were going to challenge against, and it was like a rock, paper, scissors, logic, etc. And it was cool. It was pretty easy to play. Once again, easy entry point, easy to understand, not overly complex.
So there's a couple of things I do want to pull out there, because I mean, it's not a game that should have, in the historical looking back of collectible card games, shines a lot, because it does get overshadowed by the Decipher game, to be honest with you. It's one of those ones that you see Decipher's Star Trek game that went through not just one edition, but a second edition later, and eventually ended up incorporating the classic characters much after you guys are done with it. It doesn't shine out, but I have gone back and looked at it more recently, and it is something that's super interesting. Now, before we get too deep into what the game mechanic was, I do want to mention and sort of pull out what you said there about the people who designed it. Now, you said that there were people who were big in TSR and huge names in gaming, Margaret Weiss, Don Perrin, and of course, Jeff Grubb, all fantastic storytellers. And they were also the team under the name Mag Force 7 that had already released a trading card game for Margaret's book series, The Stars of the Guardians. So it's really actually fascinating to see this connection between, Flea's Star Trek game and this other sci-fi sort of space opera type game that they had done earlier, even though that mechanically those two games are vastly different. The other thing I really want to ask is, obviously, you were very impressed by their sort of design skills and stuff like that. What was your first impressions of the game? And, at the same time, what were your thoughts on the fact that, like, going, oh, we're going to be this, I'm not going to call it second tier, but the other Star Trek game?
Never thought we're going to be the other Star Trek game. We're going to be the original series Star Trek game. That's what we were going to be, because they weren't part of Next Gen. And so we were our own little microcosm of the game that had the original series characters, and that was based on all the original series stories and episodes. And, of course, you would read Scry magazine every month when your game's out there, and you see how you were selling versus everybody else and see how you ranked. And you would go to tournaments and you would want people to show up and learn your game and play your game. But at the time, early on, never really thought about the competitive part. It was just, hey, we've got a challenge to do. This game, we got to develop this game. and their game just the mechanic was very simplistic. The way and the you fielded your team, and then as you played cards, you introduced all the surrounding cast and the mission, and it was kind of like, and you said all three of those people were marvelous storytellers. This game, when you're all said and done, if you took a step back and you looked at the game and all the cards that played as it resolved with the victor, a story was told. And I think that was their intention, and they were very successful with it.
I think it's a really cool and unique sort of way to look at the collectible card game that was made for that game, because the reviews that I've read, and I've sort of started dabbling with it, I have a couple of starter decks myself, what it really feels like is it doesn't feel like sort of what Decipher was going for, where you're, you know, a captain sort of deciding what your crew does. It's really unique in the fact that it makes it feel like you're sort of almost watching Star Trek. You're building an episode, you're building the stories that involved, and your main cast is always, like, for people who don't know, in this particular version of the Star Trek original series card game, the middle is sort of like this shared pool of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy and the Enterprise. So everybody has access to those characters because they're essentially the show's main characters, and every episode, which is essentially what a turn is, involves those characters. It was really, again, looking at it from a historical standpoint, wasn't really a combat-based thing. It was more of almost like this PvE sort of like, you know, you would play hazards on your opponent, sort of like dilemmas in the original Star Trek game. But it was a really interesting and fascinating way to sort of embrace the collectible game genre, but not make it so much about the, hey, it's my guys versus your guys. Like, tell me a little bit more about, like, you know, what you were involved with as far as the development of that game goes, and sort of just more opinions about that unique system.
Yeah, so that team, they had the advantage of being a little more involved in the development of the game, more so than the Stern brothers with Overpower. So, you know, they helped with some of the mechanics, that what should each guest character have, what should their capabilities be, and the impact to the game. So they had a little more say in that, which was nice, because we would not have been able to do all that game development along with Overpower at the time, just Ron and I. But yeah, I mean, so many hours of watching Star Trek episodes and pulling, you know, freeze framing images and saying, okay, that's the image, and you know, what should this person's contribution be to this game, and what's the editorial copy going to be? And I mean, it was such a fun project to work on. I mean, original series was just so unique in its imprint on television, and to be able to be working with those episodes and laying a foundation and incorporating all that into this game was really a lot of fun.
That's really cool. Like, and what I want to talk about is, you know, you were talking about how impactful the TV show was, and obviously that TV show comes from, you know, the license of Star Trek. It comes from Paramount, basically. And you mentioned before that Paramount was so easy to work with, similar to Marvel when you guys were doing Overpower. Tell me a little bit, do you have any stories about working with Paramount specifically? Any changes that they sort of mandated or anything like that?
They were so fun to work with. As a matter of fact, and then one of the little Easter eggs in that card game is we went through every single episode, and you know, you're trying to build cards. And so you're saying, okay, there's a character. Who is that character? Let's get the script. That character has a name, and so we would name it. Well, after you do all that, you find these images like, hey, Paramount, can you tell me, does this character have a name in the show? Like, does he have does this red shirt have a name? And during the course of that, we found a number of, you know, characters that never got named in the script of that episode.
Man 1, Man 2 sort of thing.
Yeah. So you'll know, anyone who collected the cards, we actually had a little bit of fun and we named them. So Ron got a card, I got a card, And two of the people who were our coordinators with Paramount, I think the one guy's name was Tom Parham. He was our main contact at Paramount. He was wonderful to work with. We all got cards. So how cool is that? I got my name is in a collectible card game. I'm a character in Star Trek. I was the waste disposal officer.
I couldn't think of anything less and more apt as somebody who has to sort of corral all this collectible card game stuff in the time.
Yeah. So that's just a funny little thing that I share. Anybody that a lot of people discovered that. I think if you Google it, you'll see it. A lot of times people have Googled my name for other business endeavors and stuff, and they'll say, "Can you tell me about this? You're a Star Trek card? What's that all about?" So it's a nice point of conversation for people who just met me in other business worlds.
What a great icebreaker. I'm a character in Star Trek and stuff like that. And I know other companies like Decipher and stuff delved into that sort of thing as well. And those watching on YouTube may have just seen those versions of your card, Ron's card, and even a couple of other sort of the Easter egg cards from that series. Now, I do want to speak to working with Paramount for this game. And I do want to speak about it mechanically as well, because I did find a really interesting article from sort of, the contemporary era, 1996, when you guys were making this game. And we talked about how innovative that idea was, that Spock and everything was sort of, and McCoy and Kirk was sort of in the middle line. One of the biggest pieces of feedback I read in this article was that Paramount told you that those characters were too easy to kill. They didn't want their characters to sort of fall by the wayside so easily. So you guys had to change the game so that they weren't so in jeopardy gameplay wise. Tell me, do you have any memories of that?
Yes. Well, they said, well, how not fun would the game be if you started the game with your main characters and right away, Kirk got killed? And we understand that the mechanic, eventually there are card situations that can come up where the main characters could be killed. But we'd like that to be a harder element to achieve than an easier element to achieve, because after all, in each of these episodes, these characters do not get killed.
That was a red shirt job.
That's exactly right. That was the red shirt job. And I think the team did a really good job at making those adjustments and building in ways to revive the characters if they did get knocked out, or to make it just a lot more harder to kill those main characters. But it did and does happen if you play the game.
And I think that's one of the fascinating things that people might not understand about, licensed collectible card games. You sort of mentioned it before when working with DC, not so much with Marvel, but, they're going to have these stipulations about how their characters are being treated, not just on the card specifically, but within the mechanics of the game itself. And I think it's so interesting at that particular time. Like, for example, as well, I did read that there was a bunch of revisions of the game after sort of, you guys showed the game to Paramount, rather, the Star Trek game to Paramount. And as another thing that sort of caught you guys was the fact that there was a bunch of actors that were in the original series that you guys couldn't use because they may not have ever signed off on being there, having their rights used on cards and stuff like that. Tell me about that.
Well, that happens in the trading card world as well. If a character never signed off on rights release, or they refused to sign off a new release, then you weren't allowed to use their image. There was some examples of that, and so those characters just weren't they weren't represented in that episode. We still wanted to have that episode because the goal was to have the series. You wanted to have, we had X number of seasons for the first edition, and then the next season for the second edition. And when you came to those situations, if you wanted to depict that character, you couldn't use the image, but you could use another element to represent that character. So you just worked around it with another image and because you still can use the title of the person, you just couldn't use their image, their likeness.
I loved the way that you guys just did the graphic design for that game, and I encourage anyone to go back and look at it. And it's really, really interesting. Obviously, speaking of people who were literally involved in the original series, I believe you know, you actually got to interact when promoting the game with an original actor from that series and during a convention and stuff like that. Tell me about not only your convention memories from bringing out that Star Trek game, but also interacting with somebody from the Star Trek universe as well.
Yes, it's a great story. One of my favorites that I tell people. So once again, we wanted to make a nice big splash. There was a lot of noise in the gaming space, and for us to be coming out, we were getting some attention, but you know, we wanted to make an impression to try to gravitate people to come and try our game at Gen Con that year. And so we commissioned Walter Koenig, who was Ensign Pavel Chekhov, to come and sign cards at our booth, and so he agreed to do that under one stipulation. He did not want to be embarrassed if a fan, in the process of talking to him and getting a card signed, asked about the gameplay. He did not want to get not knowing how to answer. He did not want to be embarrassed. So I had to fly out to his house in California and teach him the game in his house. So that was pretty cool. So yeah, so you know, you have your imagination of what a star on a TV series, you know, where he must live. So I had visions of like pulling up in my rent-a-car at this gate that would open, and I would go up this, you know, circular driveway to this little mansion. And no, that was not the case at all. I drove down a neighborhood street in I think it was Burbank or Pasadena, maybe. My memory doesn't exactly remember, but I pulled up and there was his address. It was a Cape Cod style house, and I went in, knocked on the door, and he came, and we sat on his. He had a sun porch, and I actually sat on the floor. He sat on the couch, and there was a coffee table, and I sat on the floor, and I showed him how to play this game, and he had this very large, I think it was like a Russian wolfhound or something, and the dog came out and started to hump my leg. So that was such a cool thing. I was molested by Chekhov's dog. It's one of my claim to fame stories, but he learned the game. He was, like I said, it was very easy game to get in the mechanic and understand how to play. And so he was very happy with that. And he did a great job.
You know, you could probably do your own Star Trek conventions with a story like that. I love that. Now, obviously, that game didn't really explore too further, and eventually in 1997, Decipher gets that sort of original series license and starts to sort of play with those characters. But tell me, you know, it was a cool game. You were sort of at the head of it. Tell me, you know, what do you remember about that game sort of falling by the wayside? Or was there any sets in production at the time? Tell me about what that was like.
Maybe that audience that liked the original series was not so much in the collect. We just never really connected the cause and effect of why. I mean, we sold enough to do, you know, a second release, but the second release, you know, you always are down from what your initial sales are for your rollout. Never quite grasped. We would have thought that we were going to just really give Decipher a run for the money with our game, and people could play both. You know, it's like you could sit down and play poker one night, and then you could play pinochle with somebody the next. With the, you know, why not at a, you know, a gaming weekend play original series and then play next gen and go through the evolution of the license. Never really was able to get any research as to why it just never really took off, because nobody ever really hated it. I think we assumed that the fan base just didn't love collectible card games as much as we thought.
So that sort of brings us to the end of your time with collectible games.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, you know, we spoke about it in this episode that Overpower is a legendary game at this point. I don't think there's very many games from 1996 that people are still playing outside of sort of, a Big Five or Big Ten or whatever. But this game is still something that people love and really get involved with. And I reached out to the people who are still playing. I reached out to the community of people who are still engaged with this game to ask them if there was anything that they wanted to hear directly from you. And there's a couple of people I want to shout out before I sort of jump into the questions. They all have individual questions, but they asked so many questions. They were so interested in the history of this game. That is Travis Morton, Scott Church, and Peter Pelletier, who all presented a whole bunch of questions for this episode, some of which I used in the body. But I'm going to move on to community questions now and sort of just ask sort of some questions that I got from the community of Overpower players now and sort of the listeners of this show and everything like that. So my first question comes from Scott Church, and he asks a little bit about, the Star Trek original series game and the graphic design. Now, I think the graphic design on that game was great, but sometimes there was stills and images that were grainy, especially when compared to the later sets that were brought out from Decipher. Do you think that there was a reason that you guys had a little bit of a lesser sort of visually appealing sort of game when it came to the screens and stills of that particular franchise? Or do you know if there's any reason that Paramount would have not given you the sort of premium quality sort of stills or anything like that?
I don't. I did notice the difference in quality when Decipher had their images from original series. And it was a question that, not having access to be able to field that question, it's something I wondered myself as well. I did notice it. I know that going through the countless hours of tape that some of where I don't know if Decipher really grasped at every potential character like we did, because we were just really scouring the entire series for characters and pieces that could be part of the mechanic. Sometimes if you were reaching far into the background, you have a focus problem, and you try to make that as crisp as possible, but you're still left with something that did not have the clarity that it really should have. So I would agree with his observation. I have the same question.
So my next question comes from Travis Morton. He asks, how do you feel as somebody who was, again, maternally sort of shepherding the Overpower game, through its lifespan? Tell me how you feel about seeing things like the Overpower community still being so active, so vibrant, still having literally tournaments all the time, including recently.
That's why I follow them. I think it's wonderful. I'm a big fan of the fans. I love what they're doing. I see a lot. I like what Larry's doing with Orange King and bringing cards to people, giving them access at fair prices. Because the aftermarket can be so cruel and people can really gouge people. But no, I'm you can't help but look at something like that and be, wow, I wish it had never ended. Like, what would we still be doing? And based on what it took to bring sets out and all, you probably, it would have eventually have died out, because you can't just keep maintaining. Like I said, with every set, the goal was to bring in new aspects to keep the game fresh, new characters. Eventually you're going to run out, so you'd have to do some regurgitation, bringing things, and then people would start to feel cheated. It's like, well, I already got this. They're just giving me a different piece of artwork, or you're tweaking up the stats. Hey, it's Wolverine, it's old man Wolverine, and that's. So I think eventually it would have, not been sustainable in the long run, because you just run out. It's not. It is so many characters and so many different story stuff, but eventually you're going to run out, and people don't want a set consisting of nothing but C-list characters. They want A-list guys, but the fact that it's still alive and kicking, and when Marvel it just kind of boggles my mind that some of the graphics that people have done on their own and developed cards. I see things that people bring up on the news feeds and through Facebook and stuff, and I go, wow, that's just amazing. The cards that people developed on their own, and they're not selling them, but they're distributing them, and they're professionally looking. They got the same look and feel, and the artwork's fantastic, and they brought some fun flavor to it. It's just amazing. I think it's awesome.
It's really, really cool to see the community still embrace the game. And, we mentioned it a ton of times during the episode, and I love the community and stuff like that. It just speaks as a testament to the way that the game played and the way that it and the perfect time that it captured people's imaginations and everything like that. Now, my next community question comes from Peter Pelletier, and he sort of asked, there is a couple, most of the sort of event cards for mission cards sort of are born from official sort of storylines, be it, Dark Phoenix Saga or, a Sentinel Saga or something like that. But he does sort of call out a couple like Annihilation Affair and Infestation Incident that aren't really tied to any known or easily familiar Marvel storylines. Was there ever a plan to sort of incorporate sort of original Overpower content into the Marvel storyline, or were those just created just for the pure sake of needing cards, or was there a bigger plan at play there?
We did not create anything original ourselves. So like Infestation Incident, if I'm not mistaken, that was based on the Collective and the Swarm, and so they were just the terminology that we chose to title that card. But somewhere, if you scour the comics at the time, there was a storyline that had some level of connectivity to that particular card. There's nothing that we created ourselves, Ron or I. It was based on a storyline that was manifesting at the time, or something or other. It may his particular confusion may be because of the way we titled it.
So my next question, of course, is going to be from Chris Sharp. Again, it's about Overpower. And he would just, more of a business side thing, more of a production side thing. He does ask, can you speak to some of the low print runs that Overpower had? Like, it felt like the market felt that IQ was especially scarce, being that it was relaunching a lot of sort of the cards that had come out before it, and especially because it was adding that intellect sort of thing. Can you speak to any of the sort of the especially low print runs or anything that you experienced that might have caused that?
So I was more on the creative side and was not as in tune with the decisions on the volume that was going to be printed. But I do remember the IQ situation. So after the first two releases and then the DC release, when the decision was made that we needed the next production run was going to be IQ, I think production looked at past volumes and tempered what they thought based on history on what they think they would make and sell, and never anticipated that there would be this clamoring for these 4-stat Marvel heroes to catch up to the DC characters. And I would agree, in retrospect, the 4-stat does do a better rounded character in bringing in that intellect aspect. And so the demand was just insane, and it sold out. And I don't know why. I don't know if they felt as if to justify another run there would be enough sales. Like the demand was great, but not enough to justify what a minimum run would be, that they would be able to sell through that second minimum run. And so, hey, I know a lot of in the trading card world, and remember, Fleer first and foremost was a trading card company, and a lot of what's based around there is scarcity and demand for things that are rare and collectability. And so some of that was the philosophy behind a lot of that. Remember, it was just myself and Ron with Jemison, while he was there, basically the first. There were other people on the team, but their involvement was, production, coordinating artwork and things like that, not so much the gaming element and what the marketing and the demand was going to be. So the fact that Flair was not first and foremost a gaming company drove a lot of their decisions. If they were a gaming company, I think the decisions would have been different.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, they would have recognized, obviously, that things like the addition of characters that people are going to need again is obviously something that's going to be required by the market. But obviously, history teaches a lot of lessons, and that's certainly one of them. Now, my next question comes from Sam L. And speaking to the fact that Fleer was also a trading card game company, how did you feel personally that your gaming products were also getting exclusive cards in trading card game sets? For example, the Batman Holo series in '96 and the Onslaught cards earlier than that.
Look, I was the person responsible for Shirtless Kirk in the Scry magazine. So, exclusive cards and what they buy the company by granting those, that's a marketing barter type of arrangement. And when you're in the trenches and you're making those decisions, it's hard to foresee the impact on gameplay later on and collectability and everything like that. So, like you so well put, you live and learn, and you make some mistakes. A lot of those decisions were made by other people. Hillshire, I did not make the Hillshire Farms decision. Ron and I had to help create the cards to go in there and the mechanic pieces and elements that would be on those cards. But to make that licensing deal with, I think wasn't there an Underoos, an underwear set as well? And I mean, there was some pretty weird deals that they were purely business and not gaming in their decision.
Of course. So interestingly, obviously, a company that's doing all these corporate deals, that's doing all this amazing sort of corporate stuff and working in a world that's just more outside of gaming than anything else, it makes sense that they incorporate that sort of stuff. And you mentioned in there Shirtless Kirk, which is going to be the question I went out on, but I'll bring it forward just one more question, because I did have a listener, Wellness Rain on Twitter, specifically ask about that card. Tell me about it. Do you have any stories about this card? It's one of the most famous cards for the Star Trek game. For those who don't know, they've probably seen it on screen already if they're watching on YouTube, but if they're not watching, they're just listening to the audio. It's basically a fantastic visage of William Shatner without his shirt on, and it's called Shirtless Kirk. It's a great card. It's a fantastic card. Do you have any stories behind the creation of that card, and what sense of humor led to it?
Yeah, so the guys at Wizards, they were notorious for their sense of humor. They were tongue in cheek every day, and so they wanted. We were joking, and it's once again you barter for, that's how your card game got exposure. If you drop the card in there and a promotional sheet, and it got some exposure by the people who read the readership of the magazine. And so when we were negotiating that, they were like, well, we want the wackiest card that's out there. And I think somebody said, like, Kirk man killer or a woman killer or something, like, well, like shirtless or something. And so we went and we found that great image of him after one of his battles where he without his shirt, as he many times was. And then, of course, based on that image, you look at your game mechanic, and there was a lot of femme fatales in the game. And so the mechanic was that he would negate the effects of female character or something like that. And it's not that hard to develop a mechanic to go with a cool image like that. But it was, a lot of fun, a lot of laughs behind that, and it serves a purpose in the game, just like any other card. And I think it had a really good impact. I'm sure it got some good exposure. It got a lot of attention as you're bringing it up in this podcast.
It's definitely something that people remember about that game, indeed. Now, I guess that makes the last question by another Twitter user, Outlaw Paul, the very last thing, and it's a simple one, and it might just be a completely technical thing, but the card backs with some of the Overpower sets had their specific year on them. Obviously, the challenge with collectible games is they all need to be compatible and shuffling in and stuff like that. But if they're created in different years and that's identifiable in the game, that affects the gameplay. Can you speak to that in any way?
The first challenge, of course, was when we did DC, because they had a whole separate card back. Um, those decisions, as a gamer, yes, it was easy for production to justify a lot of those decisions because of the card, the plastic sleeves, and they would just wipe that away. That they would dismiss that concern to say, look, if they want their cards to go together, they'll use card sleeves for tournament play, and it's hard to argue with that when that tool is there. But I was, when we first designed Overpower, that card back, that artwork of Spider-Man and Wolverine is just so cool. And if we only stayed with the Overpower, that would not have been a problem. That would have been the card back for Infinity. But you start introducing Image, DC, and Image, and then you've got that problem. In retrospect, if one could see the far future and say, you know what, hey, we can't, as cool as we like this Spider-Man Wolverine Image, we need to have something very generic that just has the Overpower logo, because we might have other licenses in the future, and this is all about gameplay. Once again, you start out with something, and as it evolves, you look at things and say, you know what, had we the opportunity to do it over, we would make different decisions.
Absolutely. I mean, I understand, and you're not the only game who struggled with that sort of thing. Obviously, in the time, there was games like that changed their name, like Jihad and V-Test and stuff like that. And obviously, thankfully, card sleeves, which a lot of players want, sort of solve that issue. And I think that players nowadays don't have that issue at all. But, hindsight is 2020, as you said. Just a generic Overpower or Verse System or something like that card back is going to service it a lot better. But that brings us to the end of community questions. I appreciate all of the time that you've spent talking to me about those and digging into the sort of history there. It's absolutely fantastic. But before we leave today, we've got one fun thing left to do, and that is Kraken Questions.
Release the Kraken.
Now, for those who don't know, Kraken Questions is this little fun lightning round segment where our guest will choose one of these 3 colored booster packs. There's 3 common questions and 1 rare game design-ish related question. What color would you like to go with today? I don't know what these are. They're completely randomized. Tell me what you'd like to go with there, Stephen.
I will take the middle just because it's in the middle. So I'm not even going to take it because of its color. I'm going to take it because of its location.
Excellent. There you go. So that happens to be yellow for those listening on the audio version. We're going to have a little look. As I said, there's 3 common silly questions and 1 rare game design question I'm going to put to Stephen to send us out today on this episode. So your first common question, Stephen, is, other than your home city, what is your favorite town?
I would say Ocean City, Maryland.
Interesting choice. Tell me why.
Well, my family vacations there for many, many years. It's our go-to vacation place. A lot of happy memories there. Family goes there, and it's not too far to get to. We go every year, so that's the reason.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love that family story, that personal connection there. So our next question is, and I think you're in the right age for this question, and I think, actually, ironically, I think the Stern brothers got the same one, if I recall correctly. Which video game arcade machine did you spend the most money on?
Spy Hunter.
Spy Hunter. I don't think I know that one.
Yeah, it was a game where you sat behind us. You sat in like a car with a steering wheel, and you drove this spy vehicle down the road, and you were chased, and you had oil slicks and machine. If they got in front of you, you had machine guns, and you had bombs. And every once in a while, you catch up to the gadget truck. You drive in, and it would load more devices, and then you go on and do. And they were out. So I spent a ton of money on that particular game in arcade ports.
Oh, that sounds so cool. It sounds like a racing game and a combat game as well, which I guess is so much more common nowadays, but it sounds super cool. Now, your third and final common question from the Kraken Questions booster pack. What is your favorite collectible card game that you weren't involved with professionally?
I like Magic the Gathering. That's the game that got me involved. It has legs. I played a lot with a lot of different people. I still have decks, and it's a really good, it's a good mechanic, and it's a fun game.
It's a game that obviously has a very open world. It's very easily, it's very easily malleable for design and stuff like that. I don't disagree with that answer. Now, last question, which is the rare one of the booster pack, so it might be a bit trickier. In your experience, what is the most challenging? What is the single most challenging thing about working on a collectible card game?
Just testing all the card permutations, making sure that they gel, and trying to avoid cards that are broken, because it's just such a challenge when it's such a disappointment, and it's like, oh, how do we fix this when you discover a broken card and you have to alter mechanics or God forbid, disband a card because it's broken. So I think that's the biggest challenge is really just testing, putting the time in, and just really trying to stumble upon these loops and things that you just can't anticipate. It's so easy to sit down and say, I just thought of a really cool mechanic. Here's a card that does this and it interacts this way. And you have no idea that there's this other card that if they played in combination, it's havoc. So that's the biggest challenge.
I mean, that expandable game designers will be nodding their heads world over, I think, and agree with you with that, because I think that is the biggest challenge. You're absolutely right. Making sure that everything sort of still works. And when you're designing a board game that's a closed environment, you can test all those permeations. But when you're adding, 135 cards like you did with some sets each and every time with Overpower, there is no way you can figure out every single combinatorial combination of all of that. I gotta say, this has been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and it's been an absolutely fantastic. And honestly, I loved hearing the stories that you were able to share with us about Overpower, about Star Trek. Absolutely fantastic. Do you have any final thoughts you wanted to go out on, or anything you wanted to say before we get out of here?
I just want to give a shout out to the people that are keeping Overpower alive. I just think it's awesome. One of these days, I'm going to get to one of your tournaments just to watch. I don't think I could even play. I have not maintained my decks, and so I would have to have somebody like spot me a deck so that I could play in a game right now, and probably at this point refresh me on some of the mechanics on how to play some of these things. So, but to have been a part of all that, and just going down memory lane with you today was just a wonderful opportunity. I really appreciate this, and thank you.
That's no problem. Thank you, of course, as well. And I completely agree with that sentiment there. I think that the team that are still working on Overpower, just as fans, is absolutely fantastic. And I love the fact that they've kept this environment alive, this game continuing going, with these characters that, the world loves literally 100 times more than they loved way back when you guys first started Overpower, because there's movies and stuff nowadays. Shout out to the Overpower community. They're an absolute gem, and I follow a lot of dead collectible card game communities, and they are definitely in the top tier of ones that are engaged and constantly trying to bring new ideas and newer developments to their game and to their communities. So thank you guys. If you're a part of the Overpower community, thank you guys for watching. And if you're not, check it out. I think the best place to join them nowadays is via Facebook. It's Facebook Overpower or whatnot. If you search the groups tab, you'll be able to find them there. But other than that, I'll thank you again in the proper outro, but you guys are absolutely amazing. Thank you. And thank you, of course, to you, Steve. Before I get out of here, I just want to say goodbye to everybody watching. Goodbye from you, Steve.
Yeah, goodbye, everybody. Thank you, Rands.
No problem at all. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you. I can't wait to see if I can get another member of the Overpower team. Perhaps we're on at some point in the future. All right, until next time, that is it. Thank you for joining me on the Booster Pack. And remember, keep shuffling. And there you have it, our episode with Steve Domzalski, all about his time at Fleer and shepherding their collectible card games like Overpower and the Star Trek original series game. Absolutely fantastic to hear those stories, and thank you so much for Steven sharing those stories. Now, as we mentioned in this episode, please go check out the Overpower community if you're interested at all in the game, if you're not already a part of it, because it's super valuable and I'd love to see it grow. They do, as we mentioned in this episode, real life tournaments featuring old cards, featuring virtual cards. I'm sure that everybody there would be happy to have new members. So jump in there, tell them that you're new, and they're going to try and help you sort of get started as well. And of course, thank you guys for listening. Now, if you do want to start to build your own Overpower collection, or even a Star Trek original series collection, or perhaps any other old classic collectible card game, by all means, please jump onto our sponsor, which is Category 1 Games. They have fair market pricing and great customer service and help bring a collection of cards to people who are just getting started. And perhaps, even if you're somebody who collects these sort of games long term, have been collecting for ages, they might even have a rare or a promo card that you might never have come across. Perhaps something like a shirtless Kirk or something like that. I'm not sure, but you could certainly go and check out on Category 1 Games. Linked in the description or the show notes of this episode. Now, as for me, I've been Rands. You can find me on social media. Now, that is CCG History on Twitter, which is twitter.com/CCG History or at CCG History, where I am most active. Or you can find me, of course, on Facebook, which is facebook.com/CCG History. Now, there I sort of only post sort of show-related stuff and whatever, or maybe the occasional sort of information about old collectible card games. So if you're really looking to connect with me, either of those work as far as direct messages go, but Twitter is sort of where I sort of center my interest and importance in this particular field, and sort of share what I learn about collectible card games on an almost daily basis nowadays. The other thing I want to mention as well is if you have a look in the show notes of the description of this episode, you're going to find my email address, which is theboosterpack@ccghistory.com. You can shoot me a message there, or you can also jump on to our listener survey and have a little look there, because that's going to tell us about where you started playing collectible games and what sort of shows you want to hear from this network or channel at the moment, soon to be network. We'll talk about that later. What you want to hear about from this show and the other shows associated with it. So have a look down there, have a look at our listener survey, fill that out. That's going to tell me when you started playing collectible games and the kind of collectible games you want to hear about, because we're going to talk about them on the show if you let me know via that. Now, the other thing, of course, I mentioned that email address. If you have something more long form to send me, please send me that. If you have any inquiries, anything you want to talk about, I'm very accessible on there as well, and I reply to everyone. So that's about it from me. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a fantastic episode. And again, thank you to Stephen for sharing the stories, especially considering his condition at the time and everything like that. It was an absolute pleasure to bring you this episode. So until next time, I've said it once and I'll say it again. Remember, keep shuffling.